is Choose Wisely, a cautionary tale. So when I was coming up with the title, first of all, I love titles. You grab the people when you've got a title. But when I was choosing this title, I remembered a movie, Choose Wisely. Remember Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? And the famous line, "You must choose wisely," it's spoken by an ancient knight guarding the Holy Grail, warning Jones and his adversary that if you choose the wrong cup, you're going to suffer dire consequences. And so this scene takes place toward the end of the film when he reaches the chamber containing the Holy Grail. And he's met by this knight who's been guarding the Grail for centuries. Now, his adversary, Walter Donovan, is eager to gain immortality. And so he selects the most ornate, beautifully decorated golden cup, believing it to be the true Grail. And so he dips it into the water, takes a drink, and all of a sudden, he starts to rapidly age. He disintegrates and turns into dust. And the knight remarks, "He chose poorly." Indiana, understanding that Jesus was a carpenter and would have used a simple cup, selects a modest wooden chalice. He dips it in the water, drinks from it, and is reassured by the knight, saying, "You have chosen wisely." You see, this scene at the end of this film emphasizes the themes of humility and wisdom and the consequences of greed and power. Our choices have consequences. And so, as I want to take a story from the Old Testament, the motivations are not necessarily the same, a little bit different, but if I can emphasize that our choices have consequences, that's probably what I want you to understand from this message. So we must choose wisely. So the story I want to tell you is set during the time of David. And this takes place after David's sin with Bathsheba, after Solomon is born, and during the time of Absalom's rebellion and his coup. The story is about a very wise counselor to King David, and then he becomes a wise counselor to Absalom. What is his name? His name is Ahithophel. Try to say that 5 times fast. Ahithophel. So one of the reasons I love to tell the stories about the Old Testament is because in 1 Corinthians 10, it tells us that these things were written as an example and that they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages has come. So we can learn from their mistakes, we can learn from their wisdom, so that we don't make the same mistakes. And so we need to understand what has happened from these men and women of God who started out right and some ended up wrong, but some started out right and full of faith achieved the prize at the end of their life, hearing the Lord say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." So, who in the world was Ahithophel? In 1 Chronicles 27, verse 33, Ahithophel was counselor to the king. Did this change? It didn't change. Somehow, that's where I was. Can someone help me? In media, I'm seeing what I want to see. No one else is seeing what I want to see. I'll just keep going. So just listen. Forget the screen. So Ahithophel was counselor to the king. And Hushai the Archite was the king's friend. If somebody from media can come out here and work on this while I'm talking, that'd be great. So in 2 Samuel 16, the advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one inquired of God. So was his word, and so was all the advice of Ahithophel regarded by both David and Absalom. So everyone regarded the advice that Ahithophel gave as someone who had not only great intellect, but so much so that it was considered practically divine. This man was so well regarded in the court that he had influence, he had power, he was an advisor, and both David and Absalom answered to him and sought his advice. He was a military strategist. And as he would advise David, he would give advice for battles, he would give advice for the nation of Israel, and he would give advice on moral issues. So, Ahithophel was a very, very important man. There go my notes. Okay, we'll wing it. So, with Ahithophel, well, this is challenging. Help me, Lord. Okay, so in 2 Samuel, it tells you who was Ahithophel. And when it describes the mighty men of David, it's working now, praise the Lord. When it Gamble, thank you. This is amazing. So when it describes, okay, I already did that. When it describes who he was in 2 Samuel 23, it describes the mighty men of David. And so if we go down, that's in this chapter, if you go down to verse 34, Samuel lists the mighty men. Eliphalet, the son of Ahithophel, the son of the Maacathite. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel. Wow, Ahithophel actually had a son who was a mighty man of David. We keep reading. Hezrah the Carmelite, Parai the Arbite, Egal the son of Nathan of Zobah, Bani the Gadite, Zelek the Ammonite, Naharai the Beerothite, armor bearers of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, Ira the Ithrite, Gareb the Ithrite, Uriah the Hittite. Recognize that name? 37 in all. Believe me, I practice saying these names. So Ahithophel, wise man as he was, great influencer. He was a man who supported David and even had children, or his son, who served with great distinction in the military. Eliam, was one of David's mightiest warriors. All right, let's continue. And here is where the story begins. In 2 Samuel 11, it happened in the spring at the time when the kings go out to battle that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. But David stayed at Jerusalem. And when evening came, David's walking around on the roof of his palace. He sees a beautiful woman bathing, and he inquires who she is. Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Okay. So now you know how Bathsheba is related, but let's look at a family tree, and they're great. It happens, great. So here is the grandfather, Ahithophel, right? He is the grandfather. His son is Eliam, and his daughter is Bathsheba, who is married to Uriah the Hittite, and later is wife to King David. They lose a son who was conceived in sin, and the second pregnancy results in King Solomon. So here you go. That's the family tree. But the etymological root of Bathsheba is Bathshua. And Bathshua actually means daughter of my prosperity. This little baby was absolutely gorgeous when she was born. And as a proud papa, he names her Bathsheba, meaning daughter of my prosperity. Things were going really well. This was a great life. And as he looked upon this baby, he was so blessed because God gave him not just a baby, but a beautiful baby. And she grows up to be a beautiful woman. And her marriage now, Eliam is her father, probably arranged by her father to marry another mighty man of David, Uriah. And he would have provided very much security and an honorable life for Bathsheba. Ahithophel is the counselor, and he knows what has happened with David. He knows that David has sinned. Remember, he was an advisor in moral issues as well. But Ahithophel's granddaughter, Bathsheba, has been defiled and violated and disgraced by his friend, King David. And this is where the trouble begins. According to law, a couple caught in adultery would have been stoned. But because David was king, the sin was covered up, and it could only be covered up further if Uriah was disposed of. Bathsheba is now pregnant from that encounter, and David decides, okay, he tells Joab, put him in the front line of the battle and then pull back. So even his death, oh, this man was killed in battle, what a mighty warrior, was a cover-up. And no doubt Ahithophel knew of it because his son, Eliam, is also a mighty man of God, or mighty man of David. And no doubt, now let's just use your sanctified imaginations here. No doubt Eliam may have gone to his father, Ahithophel, saying, I don't get it. Bathsheba's husband was killed. We were all fighting. And then all of a sudden we had the order to withdraw, leaving Uriah there left to defend himself. I mean, can you imagine? That was a good, probable reason why he's going to his father, not understanding everything. So no doubt Ahithophel learns of this deceit, but he keeps the offense in his heart. And over the years, it festers and festers and festers, and vengeance is birthed in his heart from that time on. And so this is the crux of the matter. An offended heart can lead and could be the breeding ground for deception and a downward spiral that will lead to no good, that will not help your destiny. So, after this incident with David and Bathsheba, Nathan the prophet comes and convicts David and tells him, you're the man who has sinned. David repents. But Nathan says this, and this is judgment. From this time on, your family is going to live by the sword, because you have despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. And I will cause your household to rebel against you. And I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. You did this secretly, David, but this will be done before all of Israel. David had repented, but there's still consequences for choices. Now, just like in a movie, there are different subplots, and you have to follow along as this happens, because there are backstories as to why this all, or how this all unfolds. So there are a number of scandalous events happening with David's family. There's Amnon and Tamar. Amnon violates his half-sister. That is Absalom's sister. And he is so incensed with Amnon that he plots to murder him. And he does. When he murders Amnon, Absalom flees, and he is gone from the kingdom for 3 years. David is convinced by Joab, his military advisor, to come back, and so to have Absalom come back. And so Absalom does come back, but David shuns him for 2 years. So for 5 years, David does not have any interaction with his son. And then David restores Absalom. But the plot thickens. Absalom now sits outside the gates. You would think that for 5 years, Absalom's got this grudge against his father. And it says for 4 years, he sits outside the gates, or at a period of 4 years. I don't know if he's constantly sitting out there for 4 years, but for a period of 4 years, he's sitting outside the gates. And Absalom steals away the hearts of the men of Israel because he intercepts the men coming to the king, and he says, tell me your situation, or tell me your grievance. And as they tell him their grievance, he says, oh, that one would appoint me as a judge in the land. Then every man who has any suit or case or cause could come to me, and I will give him justice. And so the hearts of the men go after Absalom. So Absalom steals the hearts, and then secretly he sends out spies. I'm condensing the story, but secretly he sends out spies to all the tribes to stir up a rebellion against King David, his father. And he sends for who? Ahithophel. Ahithophel, who is friend and counselor, advisor, confidant to David. Ahithophel, though, is offended. And Ahithophel joins the rebellion. David doesn't know this yet, but a messenger comes to David saying, David, the hearts of all Israel have gone after Absalom. And at this point, David says, we have to get out of Jerusalem. We have to flee. So he tears his robes, a symbol of distress and mourning. He covers his head with ashes, another symbol of mourning. And he's weeping, lamenting as he goes out of Jerusalem. And there are many warriors coming after him, many who are still with their allegiance to King David. Absalom had been in Hebron, and all of Israel now had gathered to him. But what happens to Ahithophel? Why would he choose Absalom over the anointed king? And why would a wise, remember, he was so wise and he had such godly wisdom. He was so esteemed in the courts of King David. But why would this man, this godly man, offer or choose someone who's trying to rebel against the king and overthrow the king? Why would he offer ungodly advice? And we'll find out what that is in a little bit. That would seal Absalom's fate and his against King David. And how could someone who was known to give, again, godly advice intentionally, because he did intentionally give unwise and unholy advice? You see, when the opportunity presented itself, Ahithophel says, I'm there. You see, the offense had festered and grown into bitterness and had grown into vengeance. And perhaps he thought, now's my chance. I am going to go after David like he went after my family. So this is how a godly man begins to descend down a path of bitterness that eventually destroyed not just his own wisdom, but destroyed him in the end. And so Ahithophel gladly rises to the task to join Absalom. Here are some clues why he did that. Again, Ahithophel knew too much of the background and knew that the king had violated his granddaughter. His son Eliam was one of the mighty men of David and knew that Uriah had been sent to the front lines and was killed, like I had said earlier. And David took his granddaughter now as his wife, and the babe that she gave birth to shortly was actually killed as part of the judgment taken by the Lord for the sin that David committed against Bathsheba. You know, Ahithophel, being such a wise man, put 2 and 2 together. Why would David, if you know the story in 2 Samuel, why would David fast and mourn and be so committed to a baby that was not his? Ahithophel went, something's not right. This does not add up. David, not only has he sinned, but now he's caused the death of my daughter's baby. Can you imagine all of this piling on to Ahithophel? And let me tell you, this was a horrible act to get over. His best friend covering this up, trying to deceive all of Israel. And Ahithophel, being that wise man, knew every bit of it. And he's not only offended, he's angry, and he is now bitter, and now he wants vengeance. So David is out on walking out of Jerusalem, mourning, lamenting, and someone comes and tells him that Ahithophel is now among the conspirators with Absalom. Ahithophel must have hidden this so well, because it doesn't say that he left the court. And as a friend, as an advisor, he must have continued in this role. But I want to tell you, when David got this word that Ahithophel had now joined the rebellion and was part of the conspirators of his son, he's devastated. You know, he writes in several of the Psalms, he says this, "It's not an enemy who taunts me." This is Psalm 55. "I could bear that. It's not my foes who so arrogantly insult me. I could have hidden from them. Instead, it is you, my equal, my companion and close friend. What good fellowship we once enjoyed as we walked together in the house of the Lord." In Psalm 41, he says, "Even my best friend, the one I trusted completely, the one who shared my food, has turned against me." So David, in all of this, see, he's repentant, but he's crying out to the Lord and saying, "Oh God, help me. This is too much for me. This is unbearable." And then his friend Hushai, remember that name? Hushai the Archite. His faithful friend comes and meets David as he's ascending up the Mount of Olives. And Hushai is going to join him. He's like, "David, you're my best friend. I'm coming with you. I'm not staying here with this traitor Absalom." And David says, "Hushai, go back to Jerusalem. You have been my counselor, but this is the plan now. Hushai, go back and you tell Absalom, I will be your servant as I was to your father. I will advise you." And so Hushai says, "All right, I'll do that." He says, "I want you to thwart the counsel of Ahithophel, because Ahithophel was so wise. No doubt that David knew that Ahithophel was going to have great counsel to Absalom. And David was was going to be done with. In other words, David was fearful his life was going to be finished. But he says, Hushai, you go back and thwart the counsel of Ahithophel. And Hushai does. And then he also says, and then whatever you find out, tell Zadok's son. Zadok was the priest. And then they'll come and tell me the plot of whatever Ahithophel is counseling Absalom, so I can be prepared and I can be ready for battle. Again, why does Ahithophel switch allegiances? Was it his grievance? Was it the offense that he had carried since the time his granddaughter had been violated? Some scholars say that it had been 10 to 15 years from the time David had sinned with Bathsheba to the time that Absalom is now rebelling. And all that Ahithophel did was rehearse, 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 rehearse. Could revenge have motivated his betrayal? Well, we're not given those exact words, but we can read certainly between the lines. So Ahithophel, when Absalom comes into Jerusalem, Ahithophel gives horrific advice. His very first counsel to Absalom is such that David and Absalom would never, ever be able to reconcile. There's some concubines there, Absalom, that David left. And if you take them, you'll show all of Israel that everything that David had is now yours. He does not want any reconciliation. He wants the ties severed. He wants David to pay. But this also, as he's given this advice and Absalom follows through, this actually fulfills Nathan's word to David, that what you did in secret, David, will now be done in public before all of Israel. Well, this advice wasn't just a political move, but it was a deeply affront to King David. And taking possession of the wives was a declaration of taking over David's throne and taking over his authority. And not only this act would humiliate David in front of all of Israel and would assert Absalom's claim to kingship. Ahithophel's second piece of advice was this: please let me choose 12,000 men that I may arise and pursue David tonight, and I will come upon him while he is weary and exhausted, and will terrify him so that all the people who are with him will flee. Then I will strike down the king alone, and I will bring back all the people with you. The return of everyone depends on the man that you seek, and then all the people shall be at peace. Well, pride cometh before the fall. Ahithophel was not focused on winning a battle, but on making sure that David was dead. And these were the actions of a man who was so consumed on destroying David as David had destroyed Ahithophel's family. You see where this offense just festers and boils over and ends up becoming bitterness, and the bitterness becomes revenge. Now, Absalom remembers Hushai, and Hushai is a counselor too. Hushai, what do you think? This is what Ahithophel has said. And Hushai says, Absalom, this time Ahithophel's advice is not good. Now, remember, he's sent to thwart the counsel of Ahithophel. And so he says to Absalom, gather all of Israel, not just 12,000 men. Gather all of Israel, and you personally, Absalom, lead the army and then go and defeat David. Rather than just using a few men, gather the whole entire nation and fight the king who has now been driven out of Jerusalem. Well, that appeals to Absalom's pride. And when Ahithophel realizes that his advice is not going to be followed, he saddles his donkey and he arose and he goes home to his city and he sets his house in order and he hangs himself. Thus he dies and he's buried in the grave of his father. So this is 2 Samuel 17. Now a mighty battle ensues. David's men and Absalom's men, all of Israel. And the fighting is vicious. 20,000 men give their lives in this battle. And this is a battle in where Absalom is killed by Joab. David laments, but yet he's saved. The entire nation is saved. And this is what I want to tell you that could happen with an offense that is harbored. You see, in 2 Corinthians 10, no, I'm sorry. Let me just think for a minute. It is in, I got so many notes here. It is in Hebrews 12. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. Let any root of bitterness spring up, causing trouble, and by this many will be defiled. This is what happened to Ahithophel. You probably, many of you may not have ever heard of this man. There's not a whole lot written about him, just a couple of verses here and there. But as you search the scripture, you find out who this guy is and why he may have done what he had done. Because of an offense that was completely festered. And so unforgiveness can lead to bitterness. And now bitterness had led to an ungodly counsel to murder God's anointed. Then when his counsel was not taken, he saw his own demise coming, and unable to see forgiveness as a possibility, probably due to his own ability to forgive anyone else or his unwillingness to forgive, Ahithophel sets his house in order and he hangs himself. Well, Jesus tells us in Matthew 24, when the disciples say to Jesus, what is going to be a sign of your coming and what will be a sign of the last days? And Jesus says, see that no one misleads you, and many will be offended. Can you not see that in this political climate today? Can you see that you can't even, many times, you can't hold a discussion with people with opposing viewpoints? They won't tolerate what you have to hear, even though they say we have to be tolerant. The tolerant become intolerant. But many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. And so Jesus warns us that, and that's why this is a cautionary tale, that we have to choose wisely. We cannot allow an offense to harbor or to fester. You know, life throws so much at you. And the older you get, you see many of life's injustices. But the key, not just to survival, but overcoming, is to walk in forgiveness. The key is to not allow an offense to fester. The key is to allow Jesus to take those hurts and those sorrows and flip the script, as Michael Fickus said yesterday. Because no situation is hopeless. For a brother offended, Proverbs 18, is harder won than a strong city. And as I read Hebrews 12, see that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no bitterness, root of bitterness springs up, causes trouble, and by many be defiled. And Ephesians 4 tells us, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from us. And be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven us. You know, we can be bitter against people, but we can also be bitter against God for allowing things to happen to us. Why? Why did I have to go through this? God can give you beauty for ashes. He will take all of what has happened if you give it to him, and he will reverse the curse. You see, that's what he did on the cross. He took all our pains and our sorrows, all our hurts, all of our offenses. And if in the last days, Jesus is saying many of us will be offended, don't you think we should be forewarned? Don't you think we should be on the lookout? God, help us. Help my heart that I should not be offended. Help my heart that I can rise above this and still have victory and still have joy. We don't want to let anger rule the day. Put aside all anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. And we're to be angry and not sin. And don't let the sun go down on your anger. Married couples, that's a great piece of advice that Jesus gave, or rather that Peter gave. You see, for Ahithophel to not forgive and to harbor this offense, his wisdom was unparalleled, which made his downfall all the more shocking. His wisdom did not recognize David's anointing as God's chosen king. Ahithophel, once a brilliant advisor, found himself on the wrong side of God's redemptive story. He didn't think that God could bring any good out of this. And what happened? He still had a grandson, Solomon, who becomes king. And Bathsheba is in the line of Jesus. He had no idea that through this horrific event that happened in his life, that God was going to turn it around and use this situation to bring about a Messiah. Oh my goodness. You see, his wisdom could not see the bigger picture. Rather than adapting, or rather seeking a different path, or deciding that this choice was not a good one, Ahithophel becomes despondent and ends his life. You know, Isaiah 66 says, "To this man will I look, the one who is humble and who trembles at my word." Humility allows us to accept setbacks, to learn from them, and to trust in the Lord, rather than being consumed by our hurts and our offenses and our sorrows and our angers. Someone said life is just not fair. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Not a great way. But those things that happen to us, those things, the injustices, because injustice happens to all of us. You're not unique because injustice has happened to you. And I'm not mitigating what has happened to you. Because there's horrific things that take place in this world. But there is a God who can redeem it all, who can turn it around and give you beauty for ashes. But Ahithophel could not ever see that. Misguided motives, unchecked by spiritual discernment, will lead to disaster. He gave in to despair, and the decision to end his life reflected a lack of hope and trust in God's redemptive power, as I said. For with God, no situation is beyond redemption. And as Michael Fickus told our graduates yesterday, God can bring life from death. God can bring light from darkness. And the biggest plan that the enemy had was he thought he had crucified the Son of God on the cross. But God had a redemptive plan. And with that was the resurrection that was going to put everything that conquered death, hell, and the grave. And I'm telling you, if you give God your offenses, your hurts, your sorrows, He will turn your beauty, your ashes into beauty. There is hope. And in Jeremiah, the Lord told him, I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans for good and not evil. Plans for a future and a hope. Things that happened to the nation of Israel that caused those people to give up, to despair, to wonder would they ever come out of captivity. And God wanted to give His people a hope. Regardless of what you've been through, and yes, there was judgment because you didn't follow me, which was the nation of Israel. They fell into idolatry. God said, I'm going to bring you back to the land that had been promised to you 2,000 years or 4,000 years earlier, through a great man named Abraham who had faith, who yearned for a city not built with earthly foundations, but he could see God in spite of everything that was happening with him. He could see God's redemptive plan for a people yet unborn. And I want to tell you, God will do the same with you. Any offenses, this is why we cannot harbor offenses. Listen, we can't let those things rule the day. We cannot let them divert us from our destiny. God says, it's even your faith that has overcome the world, right? He said He has made you more than an overcomer. And I'm telling you, God is a healer. God is a redeemer. God is a restorer, and He wants to give that all to you. He wants to make it beautiful. What had been destroyed or what had been assigned by the enemy, God wants to turn it around.